Hello, folks. Hey, Lily. Hey, Maya. How are you doing?
Hey, Ben.
Hello.
Welcome to the stream. Welcome to everybody in the chat. Actually, I should switch over to the comments so we can see what's going on. See anybody in the chat talking. So, yes, we want to have a chat today about the census. Because as if any of you remember, actually just I'm going to be one of those, hit me up in the comments below. Do like a hands up or something if you were around 5 years ago when we had the first, or the most recent debacle, because that'll be this one now, but the penultimate debacle previous. My words are really working well for me, so we can put our actual hands up. Let us know if you're coming from the pain and tragedy of the processes we went through 5 years ago. Lee's put their hand up. Matt is shuddering already. What's he saying? This may become the most social event of my upcoming weekend. I'm happy for you, Matt. It's nice to have you here. It's good to see you virtually again. Hey, Russell, thanks for joining us. Russell's actually, I've got a bit of an attribution for him later. He's been helping with some content that we're going to be looking at. But anyway, so let's actually kick this off properly. I want to welcome you all for being here. Thanks for coming. I will also want to start off by acknowledging the traditional lands, and we're all over Australia now. Presumably, we're all in Australia. If you're not, give us a shout out and let us know where you're coming from and why you're interested in this, because we're specifically talking about the Australian Census. I know there are a few others going on this year around the world, but I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we all variously currently sit, stand, lie in our virtual homes and no, they're actual homes, virtually from our homes and offices and bedrooms and kitchens and wherever we might be. And I want to welcome and thank Lily and Maia both for joining me today. It would have been a really boring monologue had they not been here. And it's going to be so much more interesting, diverse, different perspectives. And for you in the comments as well, keep asking those questions. We've got a Slido URL, which we'll paste into the comment section every now and then as well, for you to hit up if you want to ask questions anonymously. We know that like YouTube will attribute your name to it. So if you've got any questions, just hit us up either in the channel, in the stream chat, or in the Slido URL. But Lily and Maia, maybe I shouldn't ask you both to speak at the same time. Lily, maybe you want to go first. Do you want to just say a quick hello to everybody, tell people who you are and why you're interested in having this conversation today?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. I know a lot of you. And for those of you I don't, hi, I'm Lily. I also go by Atticus in my Twitter handles and my little name tag down there. And my pronouns are she, her. And yeah, I am I'm a board member of Digital Rights Watch Australia. So we are, as with many organizations around the country, very interested in the census and what that means for the digital rights of everybody in Australia. And I think this would be a really interesting conversation because it is one on which I have many capital O opinions.
The capital is very important there. Thanks, Lily. Maia, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello, my name is Maia and my pronouns are they, them, as you might have noticed from my name tag. I'm on the Twitters as Sora Maia. And the they, them is, I think, one of the reasons I'm here. As somebody with non-binary gender, I have a lot of also capital O opinions about data privacy, especially about things like minority status, for example. I have, look, my family come from the USSR back when it was USSR, and I've heard a lot of childhood stories from my entire life about data privacy and operational security in all kinds of ways. And sometimes the government is not your friend. And I have thoughts about how much information I'm willing to reveal to the government and how.
Totally. And you raise a good point there, is that as Australians, whether we're residents or citizens or just visiting, can't get out of the country because of COVID, whatever the reason is for us being in a household on the 10th of August this year, there are many different backgrounds of people, and we can probably estimate that maybe 80% of all Australians will have no real or perceived kind of concerns about their privacy or security through sharing this information. But we live in such a diverse, multicultural country where everybody comes from different backgrounds, and whether you're a first generation or second generation immigrant of some sort, you probably have. I'm not saying you to anyone in particular, but there will be people who have these hereditary thoughts, almost like things that they know happened to their families. And I'm sure we're going to cover a few of these. I've got some thoughts that are just bubbling to the top of my head right now, but we'll try and stagger this out rather than just turning it into a rant fest. I'm often the one who will be ranting, so you two might need to rein me back in, but I will also try my best to rein you two back in if we need to do that, to try and have an awesome conversation.
This might have been a mistake. All three of us have a very low step to our rant platforms, actually.
We do. We're easy
This
to
will be
rant.
fun.
And indeed. I just want to put up this little banner at the bottom, which we hid on starting the stream, because unfortunately it does, in this view, cover up Maia's Twitter handle and pronouns. But I just want to point out that this is definitely not legal advice. None of us are lawyers. And even if we were, we did actually see whether we could get somebody with a bit of legal background onto the stream, because I think there's a lot of value that kind of brain and legal knowledge could bring, but even that would have been in generic terms. And none of this is advice. Whatever comes out of these conversations today, two-way conversations, keep things coming in the comments, but whatever comes out of it, at the end of the day, you as individuals need to weigh up the pros and cons of how you complete the census. We'll go through some of those options, what the implications are of some of the questions. But yes, this is definitely not advice. This is definitely very entertainment purposes only. Hopefully it is entertaining. I believe we've already made a good start on that. It's for those of you who don't know me, a quick bit about me. I've been a software developer now for like 23 years, but a lot of all of my community engagement has always been around security, privacy, anonymity, civil liberties. I'm very, very passionate about making sure that whenever any kind of computing systems are designed, that they're done in such a way that it maximizes the data sovereignty of each person. So each person being able, to clarify, and I think this is something that is probably quite well known nowadays, but even 5-10 years ago, privacy was always assumed to be one of those things if you want to be secretive. Privacy is not secrecy. Privacy is just controlling the data that is out there about you. My Twitter handle is my full name. I was talking to Lilly about this before, hers isn't. We each make decisions on what kind of information we want to be out there and how that's linked together. And that is what privacy is. So I try as much as possible to ensure that everything that is done is with a lens of privacy and the rights of the individual. I probably fall into that category, as I was describing before, of being the person who probably doesn't have very much to worry about if if I was doxed to the government. Like, I wouldn't want to be doxed to other people, but if the government knew everything about me and linked together and I'm starting to get into issues, so I'll rein myself back already. But if they linked all my data together,
Are you ranting, Ben?
I'm ranting already. Stop me, somebody, quick. All right, so I think what we should probably do is there's probably a couple of phases, and we haven't really spoken about an agenda, which is probably a bad thing because we do rant. But I wonder whether, first of all, we go through a little bit about the difference between online and paper-based census, what the differences are, why you would choose one over the other. Maybe one of you two, do you want to go and give us thoughts about the pros and cons of paper versus online?
Yeah. So you've got two ways of doing this. And I should add also that the census is mandatory for everybody who's in Australia. I think it's mandatory for citizens and residents. And I don't know if it's mandatory for anybody who happens to be in the country. I'm not sure if we can do that, but it's mandatory for most people to complete it. And I think you get a fine.
It doesn't apply to people who are not in the country. I was overseas for the last census, and oh boy, did I watch the disaster from far away. Gosh, were there many, many opinions on the internet, and boy, was it entertaining.
What I wanted to know is it mandatory for people who are in Australia who are not citizens or residents?
Yes, I believe so. So it's a survey of households, not of people.
Yeah.
So if you are in a household in Australia, then it's mandatory for the household form to be returned by somebody who's at that home. And it's mandatory for every person in that home to be counted, regardless of nationality, citizenship, any of those kind of things.
Yeah. That leads me to another question that I will bookmark for later, because otherwise we will never get to answer the question you initially asked me, which was about the difference between the paper and the online forms. You can fill it in on paper, which has been the way that the census has been traditionally conducted in Australia, or you can fill it in online, which has not been the way that it has been traditionally conducted in Australia due to a historic lack of internet. I mean, current lack of internet notwithstanding, we seem to be able to want to do it online these days. But the default option this year, at least for those who are in urban areas, as I am, and I'm not sure about the experience of people who are unhoused or in regional areas, but if you're housed in an urban area, you end up getting a letter in the mail that says to the resident, and it has a username and password in it that will let you log in to complete the census for the people who are at your address on the night of August 10th, 2021. And that's new. It used to be that you would receive the census as a form. And there would also be like folks who would come around and, census folks would come around and knock on the door and let you know about the census and check in, make sure everything was good. And then you fill the form in on the night. It's supposed to be on the night. And then you send it back to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS. And the difference this year, I can't remember quite what the differences were last year. I assume there were some between the two, but there are some differences in questions and the ability to fill things out or not fill things out. I think that there may be, with paper, you may have the option to skip. I mean, you have the option to skip things and go to the next question without completing ones. If you don't want to answer any, but I'm not sure that is true online. It may be mandatory for you to do that before you follow on. Perhaps somebody in this chat or in the comments can clarify. And that's at least my understanding of the differences between the two.
I think what's really cool is that at about the times when a paper form with a friendly person would arrive at your door, during those epochs, we also had giant big paper books arrive at your house with everyone's name, address, and phone number in it.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Right, and at the time, none of that seemed weird. Like, it seemed like a really normal thing to do. And you think about it, like, these days that doesn't feel quite so normal.
I still remember it's always been possible in like the white pages, I guess it is, or because the yellow pages is businesses, right? There was an opt-out. You could write in and request to be removed, definitely not opt-in. And that always used to be around not getting spam calls, in my mind. I'm not sure whether that was actually the purpose of it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I suppose there were a few people who did that because of stalkers, but mostly it was spam.
So I mentioned before that Russell is quietly part of this show, and we're going to be showing some screenshots later of the online form, and Russell was very kind enough to put those together to us for us, so thanks, Russell. But yes, they are all mandatory. I think there was, I read in another tweet somewhere, and Russell, maybe you can let us know whether you discovered this, but there might actually be one optional question, which in a way possibly is even worse, because if it's possible to have optional questions, then possibly you could have designed the questionnaire more intelligently. Sorry, I shouldn't say intelligently. That's possibly offensive and inaccurate. But when it comes to designing questionnaires, there's definitely a way of doing it with a whole load of lenses in mind. And I think that making certain things optional is certainly going to make people feel more secure in providing possibly even more information. Like if I was able to choose which ones I could put in, I might give more information than if everything was mandatory.
And I think, I don't think we've touched on this, and I think, that possibly is because we consider it to be obvious, but we haven't really discussed why the census is a thing.
True.
Which is
That's probably a really good thing. And one thing that I thought we could do later as well, if we have time, is to actually go through, maybe not all of the questions, because it's a hefty little thing. and the screenshots that Russell sent through are numerous. So there are certainly a lot of questions. We might not get through all of them, but it might be worthwhile going through some of them and just having a chat about what the purpose is of them, because I think there are some that are innocuous but might look worrying, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Do either
but
of
broadly,
you two have a succinct definition of why we do the census?
Broadly, because we want to have data on the number of people who are in Australia and their characteristics, so that we can plan for the future of the country and get an idea of who people are and what they need.
Yeah,
We've had the census a very long time. I mean, one of the most famous stories of a census is Jesus. He was born in a manger because Mary and Joseph were on their way to take part in the local census under the Roman Empire, and there was a whole hoo-ha about whether the Judean, like King Herod, who was head of the Judean, like Israel-ish at the time, they were all having a bit of a soul search and a bit of an unhappiness about being counted, because nobody wanted to be counted for the same kinds of reasons that I might not. And people have occasionally not wanted, as somebody who has assets, whether they're human or otherwise, it makes sense to want to know what you have and where it is, and the distribution of needs and money and people and land and cattle and whatnot. But as a cattle, I might not want everybody to know exactly who I am, where I am, and what I'm doing.
Totally. I think so. We have a teenager living in this household. He says, trying to be as vague as possible about his own status. And
are you that teenager, Ben?
I could be. Stop outing me. This person was asking what is the big deal, not in a eye-rolling kind of a way, but a genuine interest of why are you doing this stream? Why did we get a paper form? Why are we not doing it online? And I said, look, the census is something that we should all do. I think that the census is very valuable. It helps, even at a local council level, determine what services are needed in certain regions, and knowing a rough distribution of age ranges and job types and how many cars there are on the road and all of these kind of things, they become valuable in being able to plan services for the future, as you say, Maia. But the concern for me with the census now is that some of the questions are getting to the point where there's information being gathered that is either not needed at all or can be asked in more general terms to provide exactly the same outcome. And the biggest one for me is the date of birth. And this is now where we're diving into some of the particular questions. That was actually, let me just bring up my screen share, if I can find my mouse.
Yeah, because you've got a fancy setup so that we can see the paper as well, can't you?
I do, yes. So let me just switch to. So I retweeted Kevin earlier on. I'm not sure if he's in the chat. He said he was busy, but he'd be hoping to join us soon. So I'm not sure whether he has any more information on this. In Biggin, well, that's full screen, which doesn't really make it. I suppose I can make it bigger that way.
Yeah.
How's that? All right.
Thank you.
So apparently at the moment, questions 8 and 59. I'm not sure what 8 is, what 59 is yet. But question 8 is, or maybe 59 means something different. I don't know. But anyway, I'm ranting and blathering already. Retain existing topic without change. And if we compare just 2016 to 2021, the previous one and the current one, they've changed or to and. So now you have to provide your date of birth and your age. Now, another thing he mentioned, which is something that we were all quite concerned about 5 years ago, is the collection of the date of birth was not actually required to improve statistical relevance of any data that we were, because age is fine. You need to know how many 40-somethings there are in a suburb, not how many people were born on the 17th of whatever. What the date of birth is used for, though, since 2006, I believe, is as part of an identifying key. So when your form comes in now, you've got some identifying information on the front. You've also got the bits that I've covered up that have got barcodes and stuff, and the answers are keyed against this unique identifier that is generated based on my name and my date of birth and a couple of other bits of information. Now, my concern with that is that if you have sufficient information about another person, you can generate their unique key, which is supposedly non-reversible. For software developers and mathematicians in the room, a hash is a good way of doing this because you can't reverse a hash. This is not a hash. This is something you can regenerate. So my concern with putting a full date of birth in is that's what they're using to key my identity to my answers, and that's something that I don't want to happen.
I do like the suggestion in the chat that they may be collecting this so they can buy everyone cake on their birthday.
Maybe that's why I didn't receive cake on my birthday. Did you receive yours?
I didn't, no.
The
Well,
census
that's
cake.
disappointing.
The thing is it green and square, and does it say Australian Bureau of Statistics on it? Because if so, I would totally give my date of birth. If it's fully
Really?
rounded.
Would you?
Yeah,
Is this
totally.
so?
This
You
is
would
how-
give up your privacy for
No.
cake?
My privacy is
Privacy
more
or
expensive than a whole cake.
Cake or death?
Maybe like a lifetime's worth of cake.
Ooh. So in order to give people your date of birth, you demand cake on your birthday forever. Is that true of the government or anyone? Like, can
Now I
anyone
need to-
buy your
now I-
date of birth
now I-
with cake?
Now I need to weigh up my life expectancy against this whole thing. It's become really complicated all of a sudden.
So the comment that you've just highlighted there that Matt's put up about questions being asked incorrectly or less usefully, such as the question about sex rather than gender, that is something that we wanted to get into on the stream as well, because it's been one of the most discussed about things, one of the most discussed things that I've seen, at least, within the parts of Twitter that I inhabit, because it's definitely not something that is straightforward, or it's something that excludes a huge proportion of the population, and it's something that doesn't appear to follow the ABS's own guidelines about how to collect this kind of data from people. So that's an interesting one that we.
Oh boy, is it interesting. Oh boy.
Do you have opinions about this, Maia?
I might. Thank you for asking.
Okay.
Really?
Okay, all right. Go on.
Allow me to gather some of my rant steam. I have so much rant about this. So let's let's first of all separate out sex and gender for a start. Sex is what tends to be referred to generally as the physical manifestation of XY chromosomes, sorta. It's not that simple. It's just never that simple. We talk about sex usually manifesting in the simplest terms in things like genitals. And why anybody wants to know the shape of my genitals is, for a start, just a weird question. Secondly, even if we take apart sex, which is about the physical self, as opposed to gender, which is someone's identity, and much more to do with things like social roles and understandings of self, and has very little to do with actual bodies necessarily. Just the question of binary sex is completely misleading. And even if you have a look at what the ABS has deemed an appropriate way to gather this information, there's a 2020 standard that's looking at what is in fact the correct way to gather this information. The standard for sex, gender, variations of sex characteristics, and sexual orientation variables from 2020. So even if we talk about whether somebody is considered male or female in their sex, we've then got questions of variability. Now, so much ranting. Yeah, it does ask for non-binary sex. It's true. And there's a bit of a question about that. So there's...
And you've got a paper form there. Could you put it on
I do.
screen?
I was just about to bring that up. So this is the... Let me bring this one in. So this is the actual paper form, which hopefully, if I line this up properly, we can read.
So high-tech.
The one just above it.
Looking at slides again.
So the question is, what is the person's date of birth? No, that's the date of birth and age. Which question is the sex one? Does anybody have the number? I haven't looked this one up yet. or is it probably closer to the beginning?
Oh, that bit we flipped back there about asking whether, person's father, person's mother, there's no option for like people who have
Here we go.
the other or both and all kinds of stuff.
Yes. So it's actually just above question 7. Is this person, so it doesn't mention,
Right.
as Matt mentions, it doesn't say sex or gender. Is the person male, female, or non-binary sex?
Okay, non-binary sex.
So the sex there is obviously narrowing that down. Like, what is the question now?
Okay, but is it asking about sex? Does it ask about gender at any stage? I understand the online form asks a different question.
Yes, so the online form, we have, let me switch to this view. We have 2 questions. We've got this one, which basically gives you a answer 1. And these came from Russell. And Russell, maybe you can mention in the comments again what the difference is between this page and the subsequent page screenshot that I got through. Because if we go back to the previous one, there's a bit of text up here. If these options do not describe the person, they can select something other than male or female, which looks like a link, and perhaps clicking on that takes you to this view, because that then looks like maybe it goes back. So if you consider yourself, is the question almost asking, do you believe that sex is binary? Like, that concerns me. Like, if you think that sex is binary, you should answer this question. Otherwise, you should answer this question. And apparently, if you click on non-binary sex, then you get an other form to provide more detail, maybe.
Why
So it's a free text field, right? After that?
I think so, yes. So a person may choose to select, so if no binary sex is selected, there will be an opportunity to provide more information. So I would imagine that's a free text field. But also it looks like here, like you can tick, because they're squares instead of circles, UX design would suggest that you can actually tick all 3 of them.
Gender is chaos.
Because the previous one was circles, and that's a binary option, one or the other. And then this one is suddenly, pick what you like.
Russ is saying no free text.
Okay, so like, even if we have a look at the ABS standard, where they look at sex and gender. So first out, they're separating out sex. Here we go, let's read it out. Sex is understood in relation to sex characteristics. Sex recorded at birth refers to what was determined by sex characteristics observed at birth or infancy. Gender is about social and cultural differences in identity, expression, and experience. This is discussed further in the gender variable. Okay. Third option for sex. The inclusion of another term as a third option, blah, 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 recognizes that across Australian jurisdictions and elsewhere, there are a range of options available on birth certificate, such as indeterminate or unspecified. I love being indeterminate or unspecified. That's my favorite. I'm sure it's everyone else's favorite too. But so even if we take into account things like intersex people, of which there are very many variabilities, like very, very many, for a start, those aren't necessarily recorded on birth certificates. Those aren't even discovered until later. Also, why? Like, why?
So is there and this is something that I genuinely don't know enough about, and I apologize to anybody in advance if this comes off. I'm just going to ask it. Is there from a purely biological sex perspective, is there a value in knowing these things for planning things like what kind of medical services you need? There's got to be some kind of value to this that's underlying in the question that, yes, it is important to know which genitals you're born with, but we should also be asking the other questions because those are societal questions, not medical questions. Like, we need to know both sides of the story, and this question doesn't seem to get that for me.
Yeah, so the question doesn't separate out sex and gender very clearly. It talks about sex, but it possibly also talks about gender. And you're right,
But it conflates them, that's the problem.
It does. It possibly does. I can't tell. I can't tell what they've done. This
Sure.
is the thing. Now, here's the thing. It is incredibly valuable to know how many people of different types of needs you have in your population. That's absolutely true. The fact that it's hard to answer this question, and the fact that people may not want to answer it truthfully because of the way they get treated one way or another, means that we actually have no idea how many people we have in Australia who count themselves as, say, gender non-binary and or sex non-binary. We don't know the number of people. We have estimates, but the data is very hard to gather. As demonstrated right here in this year's census form. And it's certainly not going to be better gathered this way. There's no way we're going to get better representation of either gender non-binary people or sex non-binary people with a question like that. We're just going to get some amount of information. And sometimes that's enough. Like sometimes you just need to know a rough idea of the percentage of your population that needs certain kind of services. But that's not always true. For a long time, for example, we thought that the number of gay people, for example, like the number of gay men was considered to be very low right up until the HIV epidemic, when it turned out that actually there were a whole lot of gay men, a lot more than people thought, and that the provision of services was entirely inadequate. So it's always good to have good data, which means you need to reward gathering appropriate data.
Yeah.
And I got to say, this kind of question doesn't make me feel like I'm going to be providing information and it's going to be treated in good faith.
No, definitely not.
So what is it recommended that people should be doing if they don't feel themselves to fit into one of these neat categories? What should people do? Because it is mandatory to fill out the census.
It is mandatory to fill out the census. So for a start, you have the option of getting a paper form and not filling it in at all, or filling it in any way you like. That's one. Secondly, it's an individual choice. There's a bunch of people who may consider themselves either sex or gender non-binary, but may specify for the form otherwise, may tick male or female, either male or female, probably just one. But maybe both. I mean, if you get the paper form, you can tick whatever the hell you want.
It's true.
There's something that Sam Floriani has put in the chat as well. The ABS has also said, where a respondent has provided a male or female response and a non-binary sex response, the male or female response will be used to determine the binary sex variable. Otherwise, sex will be derived by a random process. So you're going to randomly allocate the value?
I mean, in some ways, gender is kind of random, so sure. But I don't know how I feel about this. So if I say...
It's just kind of like hand-waving a part of this data that seems really important to gather if we're going to provide adequate services, not least because, people of, gender diverse people need all kinds of different services that in some cases can be really specific.
Absolutely. And it's a bit of a catch-22 where we don't know the number of people we have, so we can't ask for more funding. And anytime we ask for more funding, people say, well, how many people do you need to provide services for? Well, we can't tell you because we don't have enough funding / the right conditions to find out. Again, not a really useful system, and sex will be derived by a random process. I love that whole sentence. Like everything about that kind of breaks my head.
When I see things like this, my brain often goes into analytics of what's happening under the hood, and I have concerns not just about the questions. I mean, that's a given, because this is like we're getting shit shows, and for fuck's sakes, we agree with all of that. I want to put them all up, but there are too many people in the comments outraged, and we should be. But if we step back and look at this from a data processing perspective, they're going to assign a random value. Why is that? Is that because a partially completed census cannot be entered into the database? So does that then also infer that if I leave any question out, that none of my data is used? Because that as well is an issue. That was a question.
Yeah, that was a question that came up in the Slido questions, which we have been not paying as much attention to as we should have been because there's so much to talk about. But there are a lot of really good questions here, and please continue to put them there because we will get to them
soon. Yeah.
That's a really interesting question because so if we know, for example, that the known distribution of sex in Australia, for example, that information comes from their census, among other things, do we then just round out the question mark unknown types according to what's known? And how does that skew what we consider to be the known data? And therefore, how does that skew the data in an ongoing fashion? Is that a good way to do, data cleanup? Is that data hygiene that is appropriate for what we're dealing with?
Well, if I think of any other kind of survey that I've seen done for academic research, where questions aren't answered, you have like percentages of which answer was given, especially in multiple choice kind of a scenario. And then you also have an n value, which is the number of respondents. And the n value will change from question to question because not everybody answers all the questions. And then you can use statistical analysis to derive a confidence value for each. So these are all things that we know how to do. So I don't understand why we would have to inject this noise, randomized noise, that if it's purely random, is not going to represent the country.
Right. And how much of the data are we going to consider as acceptable noise before we start making some assumptions and using the data to drive behavior?
There's another angle to this question, and a few others that I think we haven't explored yet, which is the fact that some people are not going to be able to answer that question honestly because the census has to be answered with everybody in the household altogether. Ben, you will have, your paper form that you had has multiple columns for multiple people, and it's the one document that everybody has to fill out. But if somebody is transgender and has not, is not out about that, they may want to be honest about it for statistical purposes, but without privacy of being able to do that in front of the members of their household who may or may not know, then we're not going to get that data either.
So this might be a bit of a tangent onto that subject. It's something I wanted to bring up as well later, for my own reasons as well. You can actually get multiple forms per household. So if you want to provide your answers in confidence, you can get a second form. You can also get, some of the household could do it online and you could do it via paper. Both will still get counted. This is something I actually tweeted to AEST before. They haven't responded, but according to their FAQ, that's what I understood to be the case. And I think it comes from that perspective of being able to answer in confidence.
I mean, that's possible.
That people could be counted twice. As in, say somebody's household member makes an assumption about they're filling it out for everybody, say a parent, and then the child fills out their own, and then you have more people than there are actually people in that household.
This is an interesting question because some of the questions are about the household and some about the person. So one of the questions, for example, is how many cars are normally parked at the household or were parked on the 10th of August or whatever, but it's about the household. So if in this household we filled out 2 separate forms, then do we put down 2 in both of the forms, or do I put down 1 because one of them is mine and my friend puts down 1 because the other car's hers? I don't know the answers to this yet, and we're probably going to have to make up our own rules when we're going through the form.
The really interesting part for me is that having to request extra forms or extra privacy means that privacy is something you don't get by default, which already raises suspicion and can cause people to not provide complete or accurate data about themselves.
Indeed.
And that's part of the problem with the census gathering some of this other information, such as mandating your date of birth, which is a far more identifiable thing than your age, and including your name and that kind of thing, where there's a lot of data that people will not want to provide if they're going to be linked to it. Religion is another question that is a fairly sensitive topic for a lot of people, but really any one of these questions for any number of circumstances could be a reason for somebody to not want to be honest if it's going to be connected to their identity, which makes me question why we are linking them in this way if we want accurate information, because people are more likely to provide that if they know that it's not going to be able to be traced back to them.
Yeah. The comment you just to
I wanted to touch on that as well.
Yeah, that comment you just flashed up about trying to get a paper form. As far as I can tell, there are in fact census hubs within 50k of Melbourne CBD, because there's one not far from me, and I'm not that far out from the CBD. I'm certainly within the 5-10k range. So when I went online to look, it told me there's a couple within 10 to 20K of my place. So I didn't test it out, I got to say. They just told me, but nobody would lie to me on the internet, and certainly not the census.
Of course not.
Of course not.
Of course not.
Yes, thank you, Jakob, for your comment. Considering the NBN, I don't think it should be that suspicious to want a paper form.
Totally.
That's fair. It's more, the uptime on a paper form is better, generally.
I'm also not so worried about it timing out if I want to go make myself a coffee.
Yeah, that's true.
I noticed actually that the form where you request a paper form, the online form, timed out. The curious thing about that is that I was on this page here, and I just loaded it up so I could show it on stream if I wanted to. And then like an hour later or so, it hasn't done it yet, so maybe it'll do it during the stream. It just came up, said, it's timed out, you're going to have to refresh. I'm like, I haven't even entered anything. So it times out without anything. So I don't know what happens with the census.
We had a question about this somewhere, I think, as well. With where it says, if you don't provide your details with the name, then the envelope will be addressed to the resident. Someone's asked, isn't it illegal to open someone else's mail? My census arrived addressed to the resident, but there's no one here with that name. No,
unless you
not
name
in
your
that
dog the
particular
resident.
Case. Yeah,
A lot of places,
not in that particular case.
A bunch of people I know have named their cat the resident, which means that all of the spam goes to their cat.
Nice.
So
if something arrives addressed to Mr. Tibbles.
Does that make it? Does that allow you to legally ignore the mail? Because technically, I think to the household is a generally understood exception that anybody who lives in the household can open something that's addressed to the household. But if there's somebody specifically with that name, some body, not some human, or even some entity, my teapot is called the resident. I don't know. Does that mean that I can say, well, there's the resident. There is an entity in this building. Not if I disown it. It's just sitting on the shelf now, but it's not mine anymore. I don't. But is that a way of saying, look, I couldn't open it because legally I'm not allowed to, because there is actually an entity in this building called the resident, and they didn't give me permission?
Yes, this is terrible. Somebody's made the very good point. Somebody in the comments, a couple of people, in fact, made the very good point that even when census hubs are available, they may not be within people's radius for traveling during lockdowns. So if I left it late and my census hub is more than 5K away, too bad.
Indeed. It does seem unfair to the cat, and I just want to do a shout out to, this is Kevin, who sent through the, who mentioned those tweets about, my brain is farting. The age. The age thing being and or and got that. So welcome to the stream. I hope your meeting went well. Welcome.
I wanted to address one of the questions that we had here that touches on the sex/gender question, which was, have any advocacy bodies run campaigns on how to fill out their sex/gender question? I'm aware of Transgender Victoria having done this. I'm not sure if any other groups have.
Right.
I don't think the Intersex Australia folk have. Let's just have a look.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I've seen also a couple of Twitter threads. I know that Digital Rights Watch made a thread with many other links and resources the other day that had a few links to threads from people, particularly non-binary people, who were discussing how to fill it out and what to do. And I think that those were some pretty good ones. So if anybody's got access to Twitter and can dig them up and put them in the chat, that would be really helpful. But there are a couple of resources out there. The thing is that I guess, it really comes down to what you as an individual feels like makes the most sense for you, given that it has to be filled out. But yeah. It's a good question, because it's a shitty option regardless of what you choose. So, it feels kind of nonsensy.
Hey, so on the topic of questions, I reckon we've done a good bit of keeping an eye on the comments and a good bit of ranting. So I'm going to change my role into moderator, and I'm going to go through some of the questions and throw them out to you two and to anybody in the comments who wants to pipe in as well. So first question we have here is, to help bring more services to Indigenous communities, should I tick that I come from an Indigenous background when I don't?
Ooh. I'm pretty sure there are. I'm pretty sure the census requires accurate filling out of information. What are the consequences for lying on the census? There's a fine for not filling it in, but A, how would they track you down? And B, how do they administer consequences?
So
yeah, I don't know if there's any.
I'll probably pipe in as well from time to time.
Yeah, I don't know. It would have been handy if we could have gotten a lawyer on the stream, but we are not lawyers, so
So from a non-legal perspective, I think I love the idea of doing that, and it's for the same reason why and we'll get onto religion, I'm sure, at some point. But it's a reason why a lot of people were down Jedi. It's trying to break the mold, but also create support for what are deemed non-mainstream things that the government doesn't always think about. If everybody did that, we wouldn't have a census that represents the country. That's the problem. So what we need to do is to make, and this doesn't answer the question, this doesn't solve the problem, but we need a way for people to be able to answer more honestly so that the data we have does actually represent us. So my preference would always be to tell the truth or omit. If you think that omitting is going to represent your needs, whether that's supporting by reducing the number of non-Aboriginal people, or because it's something you want to keep private, then I would omit. Again, this is not legal advice. The banner's up there now. But if you're going to answer at all, my recommendation would always be to tell the truth, because if there is some way of correlating it, and it's deemed that you've answered incorrectly, then yes, you could be up for fines. Maybe it's a hill you're willing to die on. Maybe you will take that fine, you'll take it to court, and you'll say, well, you know what, the census is actually unfair for these reasons, and maybe that's something you want to do. But on the face of the question, I would say tell the truth.
Okay, so Kevin's saying
What if the truth?
That providing misleading information can lead to a $2,220 fine, which is a weirdly specific number in the way that fines always are.
But that's interesting worded. Misleading. Is it misleading to skew the numbers to potentially be more accurate? It doesn't say incorrect.
Well, I don't know if we're talking about, in the case of, say, falsely claiming to be part of an Indigenous community, then I'd say that that's fairly clearly misleading. And skewing the numbers to what you think is more accurate may not be. I mean, we don't want everybody to be doing that just by assuming that we know what more accurate is. We all live in our own little bubbles. Yeah, so rich people are fine. Yeah. As with most things, if you can afford to pay the fine, you can afford not to be part of it. And, paying for your privacy is one of those things that rich people are able to do in so many different contexts.
Misleading information is such a funny phrase. What if the truth is complicated?
It always is.
No way.
I love this.
Truth is always going to be black and white. That's
Thanks.
it.
Thank God you told me. Now I know.
Yeah,
we do have a lawyer on the call.
Yeah.
I love Jude's comment here. We don't have a census that represents the country now, and that's true. And it's one of those fights. Is like, how do we get there? Answering the truth now is not going to get us there, but lying might not either. We need to change the system, and hopefully, open conversations like these will help build a momentum towards that.
Yeah. Oh, Lee's comment about what is misleading. Can you flash that up, Ben?
Where's that one gone?
The very last one. There we go. I can't travel to many countries because dressing as a woman, having identity documents that say I'm non-binary or female is considered misleading. Yeah. Who is it misleading to, and when and how? And what about people, for example, whose gender identity changes a lot, who sometimes are like really clear that they're female, for example, and sometimes really clear that they're not? maybe on the night of 10th of August, they have one sense of themselves and it changes later.
I mean, that is, the fact of the census being a snapshot of a point in time is interesting. And is another reason why it would be good to have an option that lets people say, I'm gender fluid. So that means it could be anything at any point, but at least, you could say gender fluid is a label that describes me, throughout the period. But also people's incomes are going to change and people's addresses are going to change and ages are going to change, surprisingly. So that might be, I don't know, that might be something that I guess is part of what the census is about, is here is this snapshot of this point in time. The fact that it is conducted over a couple of weeks, even though it is supposed to be representative of that one night, is interesting. I don't know what happens if you fill out the data for August 10th and then on August 10th, somebody you thought was going to be home is not home. It leads to that question of who gets double counted as well.
Right.
On a lighter and more jovial note, I love the messaging being put out by the ABS with you can fill it out any time you have the form. If you know where you're going to be on the 10th of August, how many people in this country don't know where they're going to be on the 10th of August?
Well, people
very
don't.
Few of us.
Oh, well, I don't know.
During lockdown, I'm going to be...
But we didn't know about lockdown until last night.
But it's become funny now.
Yeah.
And for New South Wales, it's been, funny, not funny for a while.
I'm sorry for ruining your beautiful joke, Ben.
That's okay. I'm used to it. Not from you. That's not an attack. Lots of people ruin my beautiful jokes. All right, next one. What happens to your responses if you don't fill out all the data? I think we kind of covered that one. Well, we touched on it. We didn't cover it necessarily.
Yeah. The Section 10 of the Census and Statistics Act notes that the fine is per day that you don't comply. Joyous.
Is this for not returning the $222, or is this the not answering correctly? That's a one-off fine, I assume, the $2,222.
Yeah.
Which is 10 times the fine for not answering at all, right? It was $222.
Right. But I think yes. But I think the $222 fine, it is daily, but that's only for not complying to a letter from the chief statistician. So if I don't return my form, nothing's going to happen until I get a letter demanding that I then return the form. And only at that point does it become required to submit. And then if I don't, then I get fined. I think that's how it happens.
I love the job title, chief statistician. I want a chief statistician of my own. Yeah. I want them to show up at my house and tell me things.
Yes.
Hey, so we've been talking for like an hour now.
We have. Wow. We were planning on making this a 1 hour show and then carrying on for an extra half an hour if people were still interested. Put your hand up if you're still interested, or don't put your hand up if you want us to shut up and go away so that we can all start our weekend.
You could just close the tab, I guess.
I could close the tab and then nobody has a choice.
2 people have closed the tab.
Which tab?
What tab are you talking about?
I don't know. I'm confused.
I always want to data. Thank you, Katie.
Some of us have to work until 5 p.m. Yeah, well, maybe we can't go home, but maybe we can stop. We didn't want to tire people out as well. It can be a bit of a heavy topic, but hopefully our interjections are keeping it a little lighter.
So there are 2 more things that
Yes.
2 more things that I really want to cover off. One of them is the religion question in a little more depth. And then the other one is to sort of have a look at the other questions that you've got with that fancy camera setup of yours.
Sure. All right, go. Let's talk about religion.
All right. Yay.
There's a nice simple topic.
Yes, religion. Could you show the question, Ben? Just so that we've got the wording or whatever it is to look at.
Let's get the...
Oh, and Betsy Albert was saying that a household doesn't have any letters about the census. Makes me wonder about how many people don't even know about the census. Good question, because I've seen some census letters that have just been in like puddles in the rain on the side of the road, which is also a data privacy thing if it's addressed to the resident. Those passwords are just out there. Okay, so It's a little hard to see, but for those who
It is, but I can
read.
read it out as well.
Yeah.
So what is the person's religion? Answering the question is optional. Examples of other include things like Lutheran, Salvation Army, Judaism, Taoism, and atheism. I think this is designed to preclude Jediism. And the options are, interestingly, no religion has a bit more of a gap between it and all the other questions. And then we have Catholic, Anglican, Uniting Church, Islam, Buddhism, Presbyterian, Hinduism, Greek Orthodox, Baptist, and then approximately 36 boxes for other. So if you can fit it into 36 letters, you're okay.
Pastafarian works, yes.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question that I saw being discussed on Twitter a little while ago about the inclusion of atheism as an example of other as opposed to no religion, and some folks exhorting us to, if you don't actually attend any kind of church or temple or any kind of service regularly, or don't consider yourself to be a religious person, marking no religion is more accurate than marking other and then writing atheism. So part of what this question seems to, at least in my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure that people will, what this question is intending to do is to get an example or get a data on what kinds of churches there are, how many people attend them, and also it has to do with allocating funding. So that's at least my understanding of it.
Yeah, look, honestly, lumping in information about religion with things like people's date of birth, with people like addresses and names, it just feels like scope creep. Like, I'm willing to provide some of this information, but not all of it, and not altogether to all the same people. It really feels like they've taken something that was kind of working, really, and to give you a broad sense of demographics, and really shoveled it all up with a whole bunch of other things, and went, no, well, if we're getting this, let's get all these other things too, which is the tendency with gathering data. People get really greedy about it. I want all of it. Nom, 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 nom.
And that's the thing Lee is saying, how is Lutheranism not Christianity? Yeah, it's interesting that there's no sort of like thing that says Christianity. There's different kinds of Christianity, but there is just one thing that says Islam, when there are also different kinds of Islam, etc. So, I mean, several of those options are forms of Christianity. So that's interesting. But yeah.
So I sometimes wonder, like the question about cars and knowing how to plan for where to build the next motorway, those two don't intersect because it depends on where you travel to and all of these kind of things. In terms of providing funding towards certain things for certain different kinds of religion, is that something we actually need a census for? Or can we just detect demand? I mean, surely people who manage their own churches know if they're getting full and we need another one. Think of like these computer games where things become overloaded and you have to build another mall because otherwise the people can't go shopping. You don't need a census for this.
Well, do you? Because you want to be able to verify data independently. And just a church reporting that they need more funding isn't necessarily enough, in the same way that anybody saying we need more money isn't necessarily worth trusting until you've verified the data objectively. But,
But how objective is this data? That's the flip side of that coin, right?
Yeah. And I mean, how do you count religion? Is it religious belief or religious affiliation? If I go to church once a year with my grandma because that's what you do with grandma, does that count?
There are no questions here about how often you go to church.
Huh.
So there's no degree of how religious are you. How do you participate in your religion? So it doesn't help in that respect. There was to flip the question the other way, there was a thread by someone on Twitter about if you're going to answer, if you don't attend church, if this is something you don't feel your daily activities create a demand on society, so to speak, Predominantly people who would put down atheist or agnostic or any of these kind of things, not necessarily the types of people who are Christian but only go to church at Christmas. The suggestion there, and they mention here, like atheism would be a religion that you put down, but rather than writing down atheism, tick the no religion box. And I think the purpose of that was to be more representative of, because again, it's a study of the households of the nation in order to work out where it's not just about money for services, but that's a big part of it, where to prioritize attention. And if you identify as a religion that is essentially something that doesn't actually require attention, I don't need anybody to invest in anything for me to be an atheist if I was one. So how do you feel about taking those less, or even if you are a Christian and only goes to church once a year and you take no religion, where do we sit on that kind of line? Is that, again, going back to the previous question of should I take Aboriginal because I want there to be more services for them? Is that the flip side to that question? Where do we go with the no religion side of things?
It's complicated. I'd kind of like to. I'd be really interested in understanding how this information gets used and what political pressures there are around shaping the questions. Because I imagine if there is some around that would change the way I participate in the survey. Again, how do we verify that this data is going to be, first of all, gathered, but secondly, distributed, kept, and used in good faith? And, what do we consider good faith? Whose value is this going towards? There have been plenty of allegations and investigations in the past that show that we've had MPs and government departments interfering with the way questions are phrased, the way data is used.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
This comes up every year.
There.
Yeah.
Oh, go on, man.
This comes up not every year, every census, and the comparison back to Nazi Germany. So let's just put that one on the table as an example point of the worst that could happen. There's always the argument of, yes, but we've learned from history, but then we got Trump. So I don't want to get into left-right politics, but there is always going to be a situation where we can't foresee who the next leader of the country is going to be and how they take the country and what happens with this kind of data. We already saw issues with like local, the RSPCA, for example, was on a list of people who could access census data because there was something tangentially relevant to them. Where do these gray areas come in? So we do need to be careful about all of this data, how it's linked together and how it identifies us for the worst case scenario, which will hopefully never happen, of things we've seen happen in history, as well as just the general abuse. It's horrible to simplify abuse to generality.
To be specific, the horrible things happening in history have been, here's a handy list of all the people of a particular religion and all of their locations and other demographic characteristics, so it makes them easier to target.
Yeah.
Not very historical either. In plenty of countries,
sure. It's still happening.
That's happening right now, possibly even here in certain ways.
Yeah.
Learning from history. It's worth kind of noting that a lot of the last century is repeating according to very similar lines. Just saying.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Let's get on.
Let's. So I don't know whether we had any other questions in that Slido, but one of the other things we want to do is just go through these questions and see whether anything jumps out at us.
We have some here.
Do that?
Oh, no, go.
Yeah, I was going to. There's at least one really interesting one. I think question 37 that asks about how many babies that have been born. For each female, how many babies has she ever given birth to? There's some big assumptions there about who it is that gives birth to babies. It's not just female people that do that.
Yeah, okay. It says exclude adopted, foster, and stepchildren. Okay, so this is yep.
Yeah, it's a little bit tone deaf.
There's
Yeah.
there's
Say the
that.
least.
There's also the question about assuming a person has a father and a mother, and there's no question there that says, say something like a parent, where
Yeah.
somebody has two parents of the same gender, or whatever.
There was something in the online version I noticed when I was going through Russell's screenshots. I'm wondering whether it's the same here. If anybody knows the question number for the tell us about your mother and father.
This
How
one,
very
you just
Freudian.
had it. Page, go back.
Right, back on.
Yep,
There.
there. In which country was the person's
father
father?
born? If the person does not know their birth father and has a second parent, please include the country of birth of the second parent here. How do you define first and second? I suppose that's up to each individual. If the person has same-sex parents, include the country of birth of one of the two parents here. But why not just say...
How many? Why stop at two? There's
three?
plenty of people that have more than two
That's something
parents.
jumped out at me. You could have... I can't speak for anybody who has more than two parents because I've never experienced that. But first of all, you don't need to specify father and mother. You just say first parent, second parent, and maybe people have a first and a second and a third and a fourth, or maybe they're just all parents, and it would be really hard to answer that question too. I don't know, but yes.
There's a comment here as well. As someone who works in maternity, I have no sense that this data will be used to provide better services regardless of gender. Resources and options are less than ever. It seems like it's just information for the sake of it that continues to let us control people who have babies. Yeah. A lot of these comments. A lot of these comments, I just gotta. Yeah, I have nothing to add, but just yeah.
Glasson does mention not even step-parents seem to be covered.
Yeah.
They kind of do under,
relationship to the other person. Well,
but also under the father-mother questions, there was one of the weird
because
caveats.
a child could have a mother and father and a stepfather and a stepmother in a split family.
And also
could have a mother and a mother and a stepmother and a stepmother and a stepfather.
Like there's quite actually a fair amount of literacy and like all different kinds of literacy required to be able to untangle all of those instructions.
Totally. And
if
you don't think about it hard enough, then you're giving the wrong answers.
Right. And then are you liable for a fine?
That's another thing too about the accessibility of the census, both in terms of accessibility of comprehension of the census and accessibility of the census for people who may not be exposed to it in other ways. Is that a topic that folks have thoughts on? I know that the census, for example, is involved in it is available in Braille for people who aren't sighted.
Yes, good question. I'm not familiar with other options other than paper and online.
Yeah, and look, I mean, from what I understand, part of the reason the census went online is because lack of funding, because it actually takes a lot of resources to get the census to everyone and then gathered and data crunched and all that. So, God, I really feel for the people who work for the census. Like the people who work for yes, they have a job.
One of the comments, it would be really nice to know where the data gets used. Could we have a citation system like you do in academia? Which is making me think of the GDPR and the way that questions have been asked about the cookies that you end up seeing on websites and people needing to now justify what the cookies are for. We use these cookies to track you for advertising purposes. We use these cookies to store a session so that we can remember who you are and what you've actually decided to put in your shopping cart. It would definitely make the census longer, but it would be very helpful to know what kind of data is going to be used for what, or what the intention of the question is, because it's probably not practical to know ahead of time what kind of data will be useful to people in all cases.
Totally. It kind of goes against everything that we think about in any data collection, though. There's my favorite term, Datensparsamkeit, which is the lovely mangled kind of German word, which means to be very sparse about your data collection, because the less you own, the less danger it is. But this seems to be collecting a whole lot of stuff just in case.
Scope creep.
Love it.
I love that we've kept going. We've actually picked up more viewers than we had when we started.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're having so much fun here. We hope you are too. Hit us up in the comments if you've got any particular questions you want us to look into, whether you have a question number that you want us to discuss, or you want to know whether there are any questions about anything in particular. Otherwise, we're just going to keep randomly going through this.
Yeah, I'm afraid the rant is opt-out only. I mean, if you're watching,
Totally.
You're in for the rant.
Yeah, absolutely. There is no option.
So, there was a question that I wanted to bring up that was in Slido. Digital privacy is interesting for the online census. It seems to be hosted on AWS, which is a US-based company. Does this mean that AWS has access to the data? So yeah, there's this sort of, I think, is not just... This is a topic that's interesting to explore, not just from the AWS perspective specifically, but because who has access to the data is very interesting from organizational point of view, how long the data is stored and retained, that kind of thing. Is that something that, Ben, you've got much more information about?
So I don't know how this is set up in AWS. I know nothing about the implementation. I know it is possible to set up AWS environments that are containerized away so that nobody has access to them except the owners of the containers in some way. There are also really interesting new technologies coming around. Like I was just talking to the founder of CipherStash, I think it was called, and they basically they're a database in the cloud that you can store stuff in that's encrypted at all times, and there's no way for even them to read it in any way. So there's certainly ways that it can be, the infrastructure can be designed to allow only the ABS to have access to it, or whichever government agency. But whether AWS currently has access to it, I would imagine so. Like I would say that the odds are that it's designed using fairly standard design principles, get it up and running as quickly as possible. That kind of, not shoddy, but just also not going over the top in terms of ensuring security.
Well, I mean, if you've got the data encrypted at rest and you've got the actual storage encrypted as well, then provided that you've got the keys stored in the right way, it's not necessarily true that AWS will have access to the actual data that means anything. If they may have access to the encrypted data, but if they can't read it, then it's not useful to them. What's more interesting to me is about the way that since the Assistance and Access Bill has changed in the last little while, and the laws have changed around this, we don't know whether any technical assistance requests have been made to the ABS as a communications provider, i.e. somebody in Australia who has a website or an online service. So we don't actually know whether that data is going to be made available to any other places, and the ABS would not be able to tell us because of the presence of the laws that we now have in Australia about what kind of assistance and access can be provided.
To be honest, I had always assumed that because the ABS is a government department, that the government automatically could just ask for it anyway.
Yeah.
Yes and no. It's not that simple. It's never that simple.
There's another question in Slido, which is about, doesn't the government have all of this information about us anyway, and why can't they just get the information from there? And this is, because government departments do not always talk to each other and cannot always talk to each other, and we don't want them to be able to share all of this stuff with each other. It is actually a good thing that we are asking these questions independently of just hitting up the tax office or whatever. We don't want people to be able to correlate this kind of stuff. It should be relevant to the services that they are going to provide.
Very true. But again,
Sorry,
how do
Maia,
we
what were you
then
going
know
to say?
what? Yeah.
I was just going to talk about data interconnectedness across government departments and who's allowed to have what data. And nominally, you'd think you'd be able to do it, but also you can't, is the short version. It's not that simple. You can't just go into another department's area. You've got to go through all kinds of hoopla. There's, there is, in fact, the law's kind of changing around all that, around how governments are allowed to share information and interlink it. That doesn't change the fact that some data has to be stored nominally in Australia. For example, if your data is considered sensitive, for example, medical data, it has different requirements than just generic data about you. And that makes it harder to link up. And it's not impossible, just harder. And one of the things we probably want is for data to not be as linked up. And we want barriers in the way. And sometimes the easiest barrier is just to just make it technically goddamn difficult. That's an okay way to do the data bacon. Can you pronounce it for me, Ben?
Datensparsamkeit.
Thank you.
Did you say data bacon?
Data bacon.
Data bacon. I
love
prefer
it.
data bacon. That's what I'm going to call it from now on. See, I think the confusion that I had was that the whole idea of the linking key between the identity of the person answering the questions and the questions was that departments would be able to request access to the data in aggregate, and they'd be able to run reports. And sometimes some keys would be used in order to be able to generate the link between different questions, so that you could say how many people between these ages live in this suburb and are Lutheran. So you need that key in some way. But the concern was that the key could be reverse engineered to actually determine the identity. So I think that's where my confusion possibly came from, that I thought that all departments would be able to, sure, request access to the query engine, but I didn't think that there was going to be like a huge impediment from one department to another to get access to that. I'm happy to be wrong. I would be very happy if I'm wrong about that.
It does tend to be difficult from one department to another because you have to justify your need for it. And government departments tend to have a bit more circumspect oversight over things like that. There are, in fact, a bunch of ethical considerations that need to be accounted for. You kind of have to justify why you need it and what you're going to do with it.
I guess I just have very low trust that the level of the bar is high enough. Like when we have stories about police being able to access databases about exes that they've got a restraining order against, and the bar to access that information is, I'm a police officer. I don't necessarily trust that the other bars are much higher than that.
I think you'll find that there is a lot of agreement for your view. Nominally, there are all kinds of hoops to jump, which doesn't mean that those hoops are right, but the hoops are also controlled largely by people. And again, the simplest thing to do is bypass the technical hoops and do the social engineering.
Absolutely.
And I am a cop actually comes with a lot of inbuilt social engineering.
Justin's got some good comments there. Yeah, you just chucked one of them
I love
up.
that one.
Yeah.
As somebody who's read some of the data sharing agreements, they just make up a plausible sounding story and then do stuff like Robodet. Yes. Also very valuable. Always salt your data bacon.
I love it. Yeah, there's a lot of there are a lot of data bacon fans.
A data bacon and a data bacon.
Oh, can I call myself an influencer now?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you can. Thought leader.
You're a data bacon thought leader influencer.
Oh, that's great. I'm putting that straight on my CV.
Do it.
Oh dear. As Justin points out, no consequences when it goes wrong.
Are there any other questions that folks have about the census, about any specific questions on the census,
So there was
or
one
anything
earlier
else that we
about
haven't touched on?
if you're doing the paper version, what are the markers, which I think is possibly worth going through.
Oh, yeah.
So
Go and show
let
us
me do
your
this share thing
identifying
again.
information.
That's right. So I have, I don't know why I bothered, because it's probably not readable anyway, but here we go. So I've managed to cover up. So under here, we have a barcode, and the barcode scans to be a number, which is also printed just above. And that number, I believe, is an identifier for your household in some way. It's different to the census number, which is over on this side here. So this one is like the 9 or 10 digit or whatever it is census number that you can type into the online form if you want to complete it online. And then there's a password. So you could receive this, do it online, enter your number and password. And then under here, that's obviously my address and one of those address barcodes that turns in. There's the number over here, and I'm not quite sure what those are. From what I can tell looking at the document, those are the only identifiable bits of information. The form looks like it's mass printed. Looking at all of these pages, it doesn't look like there's anything printed on after the fact, after the document's been produced, other than this text here. And you can tell that because the glossiness sort of this text is quite matte. It's like it's been like professionally mass printed, but then these have got a slight glossy texture, almost like it's been run through a laser printer and had these bits of information added on afterwards. So my thought is that if you cut out this box here and you cut out this box here, which quite conveniently, let me just zoom out slightly so you can see it in a bigger context, which quite conveniently on the other side is just this FAQ section, you could actually technically cut from this line here across and remove the whole top 2/3 of the front page and remove any identifying factors. I've looked through the rest of the document. I've held it up to a light. I don't have a UV light, but I don't think they're going to go to the extent of putting UV invisible ink or anything. But there doesn't seem to be any watermarking. Everything else, I didn't need to anonymize anything else in here. It feels to me like the only thing that's modified, every form is exactly the same, except the bits that are printed under these labels. That's my totally unprofessional. I'm not a forensic analyst of documents. That's my totally unprofessional analysis.
Here's your live hack soaring guide, folks.
Something that I remember doing last census, which I haven't seen suggested this time around, is to get the paper form, but then also to swap the paper form with somebody else so that the identifying number is not something can be linked back to your household. Yes. So I think if I recall correctly, last time I took it into work and we did a big swap, so it wasn't just a one-to-one thing, but then, I go and swap that with someone else, who swapped that with someone else, and by the end you didn't know whose you had. But that meant that you could fill the census out and return it without having a number that had been tied to your household in some way. And I don't think that would have any necessarily bad impact on...
Oh, God.
I don't think it's going to...
Now I've just got in my head this beautiful data problem of like cross-correlating Facebook links, like, the data map of who knows each other and trying to reverse engineer this entire situation of how did this census number get to be in the hands of this person who is apparently very far away from them socially.
Yeah, I have no idea what that did on the back end, but it did mean that then I was able to fill out a form that could not be tied back to the address that I was living at the time. If you
so
identify
on that, and also this question that Matt's just put up, with swapping and there not being any implication of submitting a form that doesn't have your numbers on the front, it does mean that potentially you could be fined, or at least get a letter from the what's our favorite job title, chief statistician. You could get a letter if the person who ended up with your form doesn't return it. I don't think there would be any... I mean, there's always a possibility that at some point in the future something in that document would flag you, and I don't know, the stormtroopers will come around to the wrong house. I don't know if that's in our near immediate realms of possibility. But I think Matt's question is tangentially equivalent to that, in that if the data is either against the wrong household or against no household, is that actually valuable? in my opinion, and I'd love to know what you two think about receiving these totally anonymously. If you provided, I would be happy to put in my postcode. I'm not sharing this screen anymore. Let me just bring that up. And I'm going to take the names away because unfortunately Maia's face keeps getting obscured by other people's pretty faces. So let's zoom in again. So I would be happy to provide the, move it up. I would be happy to provide the postcode because that is valuable information for planning purposes. It's useful to know which suburb I'm in. They don't need to know which exact suburb necessarily. Perhaps it would help. Postcodes can often resolve to a number of different suburbs, but they're all in close proximity. Definitely don't need my street address or number or any of those things to provide me with better services. I can't think of any great benefit of that. Maybe working out whether they need to bring in more recycling pickup trucks. I don't know. But surely they have other ways of getting that kind of information. So with just the postcode, and then maybe my year of birth, but again, they wouldn't need my name to be able to provide me with services. My year of birth to give them a rough age range, or even my age, which is an option, and a postcode would be enough to give value to the rest of the data in this, in my opinion. What do you two think?
I think that that's probably fair. That, you know, a postcode and a year of birth would be enough. Considering that this is trying to look at things on a national level, it does feel like the data that you would provide otherwise would be the more interesting and relevant, really. Like, your name is probably the least interesting part of that in aggregate, honestly.
I largely agree with it. The year of birth is enough. In terms of geographic granularity, I actually think it's worth knowing more than a postcode because services get allocated on different sized locations. And if we break them down, actually, then you're not always counted just across your postcode. You're counted across your local government area and like some like different sized bites of geography, and some of them are kind of like about a block size, and that makes a big difference to what services are provided, especially hyperlocal ones like churches or synagogues, for like places where people need to walk, or disability services. Also density of housing in the area, those kinds of things. Yep, they can be thousands of kilometers in terms of regional, but regional areas are a whole bunch of other thorny data problems and service provision. So many different things. In terms of age, though, just the year of birth, I think, is perfectly good enough for this, because what they want to know is the demographic of people and therefore the risk. For example, things like medical risk or how many people are in the workforce in a certain age range in this area.
Or to contribute to those graphs that say who's a boomer and who's a Gen Z and all of that kind of
Right, therefore who's
Very
allowed
important.
to make fun of whom with what kinds of memes legally, that's right.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, who is allowed to use the laugh crying emoji?
I've always wanted to know, do you know? I mean, you are the youngest here, Lily, I'm pretty sure. You're the only one that's legally allowed to make that distinction.
I believe we have some emoji experts in the comments who may be able to offer more information.
Do we
It's
need
possible.
to call some kind of international authority?
Yeah, there might be some consortiums who could help us out. Do we have like the president of Unicode on the line? Anyway, yeah. So the census.
I'm interested in this. I'm interested in this comment by Justin. The census data is split up into statistical areas of different sizes. If it all boils down to the end of the day of that one statistical area, and anything regionally outside of that is not valuable, I'm not saying that's the case, but if that is the case, in the same way as we can put down an age instead of a date of birth, wouldn't it be interesting to have an online system where you can put in your address and get your statistical area code, and then instead of having address, they could have an or, what's your statistical, easy for me to say, area code.
Yeah.
That would solve a lot of problems for me. Like, I'm happy to be counted and I'm happy to represent a certain region that the ABS wants to know more information about.
It does also add some complexity for people who already have issues with access to the census in lots of different ways. People who are unhoused, for example, people who don't have literacy, all of those kinds of things. Oh,
just want to point
lovely.
out that my session expired again.
Oh,
Didn't do
good.
anything, but it expired again. Just so you know. Just thought.
Well, I wonder what is making it expire. How
Time,
does
I
it?
think.
Yeah, no. Thank you.
Time.
What even is time? But seriously, why is it expiring? What data is it gathering about you in a range of time to know that it needs to expire now?
Look, about the only thing it knows about me at the moment is how lazy I am.
And your IP address, or what it thinks is your IP address.
Indeed, yes, I am coming from Germany. Or is it Singapore at the moment?
I mean,
can't remember.
Germany is the largest exporter of data bacon.
It's the largest exporter of data bacon, indeed. And you would know.
So we have hit the 90-minute mark, which is about where we thought people's energy was going to hit a wall. And we're making
including
jokes.
ours.
So is this the kind of place where we should call it?
I reckon we should see if anybody. I think we should thank everybody for coming. I'd love to thank you two for coming as well. It's been so much more fun than had I just been talking to a wall of text. And there's been so many perspectives that you've brought to this that I haven't had. Hopefully I haven't just brought the standard white male perspective to it as well. I'd like to think that I have a little more than that to offer, but it's certainly been so much better with you two. I think the questions we've had in the comments, as well as through Slido and elsewhere, have been brilliant as well. And there are people in the comments who, outside of just asking questions, have helped me, helped all three of us with prep beforehand. So thank you to everybody for making this a really interesting discussion. I would be happy to stick around. I've got a hard stop in 25 minutes, so I'd be happy to stick around if anybody else wants to carry on the conversation, go through any questions, if that's something people want. If you want to call this an end of the day, we'll call it the end of the stream. Then we'll let people get on with the rest of their day and the last 55 minutes of their working week, I think. Is there anything either of you want to kind of add in closing before we do call it into the official session?
I'm sure all of us are available for further ranting on Twitter outside of the hours of this live stream.
Oh, yes.
Most
Very
likely.
happy to keep ranting on Twitter. And I think everybody's Twitter handles are in their name things there. So if you don't know who any of us are on Twitter, you do now. But yeah, I'd be happy to keep the conversation going there.
When I have
the
highlights.
Also kind of interested in running the census through a proxy while I'm
you did say
looking at
it.
Yeah, just to see sort of what traffic's going where and what they're doing, which would be an interesting thing to do. But I haven't done that yet. So if I do, I'll let you know. But yeah,
Definitely.
it's been a really great conversation.
On Twitter to find out more.
It's been a really great conversation, and I agree with Ju that it's kind of cathartic actually to talk about this all together.
Definitely.
Thank you all.
Yeah. All right, let's put everybody out of their miseries. Get on with our lives. This will at some point, I think, turn into a standard video on YouTube. This is the first time I've done a YouTube live, so I think it'll be viewable. So if anybody found value from this and thinks that other people should hear about it, that link will, I guess the current URL will become the final URL. Who knows how these things work. But anyway, thank you everyone so much for your time, and I will hit the end broadcast button. Ciao.